Hello, and thanks for listening to Forward, a podcast about the compelling stories, important issues, and memorable art that move us. My name is Mari.
And my name is Christopher.
Thanks for joining us this week.
On this week's episode, we'll be touching on topics of college education and preventative care and talking more about gentrification and who can and should be taking steps to address it. Every episode, we start off with our weekly article forward, a segment where we each share one article that made us think this week. Mari, what article are you recommending people check out?
So there's this article in NPR that came out, I think just this past week. It's called, Would College Students Retain More If Professors Dialed Back the Pace? If you're like me and you're in grad school already, the headline sounds good to you. But basically, the author of the article says that she read this study about, why if you read a book really quickly, or even if you like binge watch a TV show really quickly, why you don't remember as much of it. And it turns out that if you read something more slowly in installments over a longer period of time, or even, with a TV show, if you watch just one episode per week, you're more likely to actually remember the content. And so she was applying that to, the idea of a curriculum. And she interviewed this professor who kind of did that, where she had this course. It was just a 1-credit course. And all they did was slowly read Pride and Prejudice, and they would, really discuss it each week. And she found that the students got a lot more out of the content because they were actually able to, absorb it and take it in. So it was an interesting article. Kind of makes you just think about like the way that academia is so focused on, getting through as much content as possible very quickly, and if there's much benefit to that. So yeah, check it out. We'll put the link in the description on SoundCloud. It's an NPR article called Would College Students Retain More If Professors Dialed Back the Pace?
That clearly is why I don't remember anything. Even the show we're going to recommend later, when I was writing up my quick thoughts on it, I was trying to think of kind of all my favorite points, and I had to come to the realization that I kind of forgot them. But anyway,
because we did binge that. Because we did binge that in like 2 days.
We'll get to that later though. So the article I'm recommending is titled "Preventative Care Saves Money." Sorry, it's too good to be true. So if you follow the topic of healthcare in the U.S. at all, you've undoubtedly read, seen, or heard somebody talk about the merits of preventative care. So the obvious benefit is that it makes people healthier, but you also see pundits always mentioning the fact that it's going to save money down the road on healthcare costs. Well, it turns out none of this is really true. And this article really digs into a few different studies that start to dispel that myth, but what's really great is it also makes a case why we still need to prioritize preventative care. And really, I think this article is great because it prompted a real shift in my perspective, and really just by presenting the research in a really easy to understand way. And that's why it's my forward of the week.
Cool. Really interesting and topical.
So next up is the main segment of our podcast, which we call Forward Thinking. In this segment, we're going to dig deeper into one topic that's been on our minds this week. This episode, the topic of discussion is gentrification, and more specifically, whose responsibility is it to prevent its spread and the side effects? Certain cities dominate the discussion around gentrification, like San Francisco and Seattle, where the never-ending tech boom has reshaped these areas for better and worse, and it's caused rent prices to skyrocket and longtime residents to leave. No major city is immune to gentrification, though, and even in the 5+ years Mari and I have lived in Chicago, we've seen neighborhoods change drastically the moment more affluent individuals put down roots. However, every year that passes, nothing really changes. And almost every article or story we read about gentrification puts the blame on the individual for causing it, and then also the burden for them to prevent it. But what should government be doing to mitigate the spread and effects of gentrification? And what responsibility do businesses have? Before we dive into this whole topic, I think it might be helpful to establish a definition of gentrification that we'll be working from in this segment. I'd like to put forth the following, which I stole from a Brookings Institution report on Wikipedia, so it's going to be really scientific. Gentrification is the process by which higher income individuals displace lower income residents of a neighborhood, thus changing the essential character and flavor of that neighborhood. So Mari, what do you think? Whose fault is gentrification?
So I found a good quote, that I liked, and it's from this article. It's actually a blog post written by a guy in Toronto, and he was talking about, like, obviously he's talking about gentrification in a neighborhood in Toronto, but I think it's really relevant to gentrification in the U.S. too. He has this paragraph that says, "The main choke point in this cycle of gentrification is the displacement of existing tenants. This is because one of the few stabilizing factors in the Ontario housing rental market is the existence of state-imposed rent controls," which obviously don't exist for the most part in the U.S. Vacancy controls once placed restrictions on landlords' ability to jack up rents in between tenancies, but they were eliminated during the neoliberal assault of Mike Harris's so-called common sense revolution. In their absence, landlords have been given a strong incentive to push out long-standing tenants whose rents are often much cheaper than the citywide average in order to bring in new tenants who they can then charge whatever the market will allow them to get away with. And to me, that kind of does sum up in a nutshell what the issue is. There are certain, market factors, different businesses, different, people with higher incomes coming into these cities. But ultimately, what happens is the landlords see an opportunity to make more money. And so they price out their current tenants, start charging much higher rents that people with these higher incomes can now afford. And people who have been living there for generations suddenly can't afford to live there anymore. And that's, I think when people talk about gentrification and why it's a bad thing, that's what most people are referring to, is the fact that people are getting essentially kicked out of their homes.
It's funny. I was kind of listening to you talk, and you said things like neoliberal. I'm like, I have no idea what she's talking about. But then,
I can talk about that.
Well, I think let me mention my thing first. The more I research this, obviously you quickly come to realize, despite hearing everything about race and class, it's really all just about money at the end of the day. It's about people seeking lower rent and driving migratory patterns in a city that eventually result in someone seeing a great business opportunity like you're talking about. And I think the scary thing sometimes too, and this isn't the topic of discussion here, but it's almost kind of impossible to stop. It's just our natural behavior to always want to seek out more value, as in I want to find a place with lower rent because I want to save money. And it's almost a natural instinct if you're a business, I want to find a way to make more money. And that's where the role of government sometimes comes in, that they need to help regulate our human tendency for greed.
Right. Well, and that's actually a good way to introduce the concept of neoliberalism, which I think is actually a really important concept when we're talking about gentrification. So what neoliberalism is this like sort of economic, but also a sort of political, like, government movement that really gained steam in the 20th century in the U.S. And you'll immediately recognize this philosophy once I describe it to you. Basically, what neoliberalism is this idea that businesses should be not only be allowed, like, free reign of the market, to, just like, this whole, like, this is because the classical liberalism idea is that the markets are free, like completely free. And, they'll end up doing what's best for the economy as a whole, like just through natural market forces. What neoliberalism is more about is that, but with the government helping businesses, to, make as much money as possible, essentially. And, proponents of neoliberalism would probably not describe it that way, but that's basically how it is. And so essentially it's just, the philosophy is that businesses should be allowed to conduct their business however they want to without any government restriction, because that's ultimately going to be best for the economy, and that the government should basically clear the way for them to do that. But as they talked about in that blog post, that usually doesn't turn out to be true, because in Toronto, this blog post was talking about, so in Ontario, like province wide in Ontario, there are rent controls, and that was in existence for a long time. But then in 1991, they deregulated newer buildings, so anything that was built after 1991 was not rent controlled. So then only the older buildings were. Obviously the idea being that having fewer regulations would entice more developers to build rental properties, and then that would, increase rentals, and like the rental market would increase. But what they found happen was that the number of rentals more or less stayed the same, but the rents just went up. So basically that just meant that there was no more supply, and but everything just became unaffordable. And that's what we see in cities in America too.
Yeah, I feel like businesses never need any help in making more money. That's literally what they're designed to do. They don't need the government's help. They don't need any person's help. If there's an opportunity to make more money, they're going to do it.
Exactly.
I think that, and you bring up a lot of really good points about the role of government, and I do think they're in really the best position to act in terms of making sure there is still some kind of affordable housing in the area, because most areas do have that, and making sure that stays the same. But also when they see areas start to change, even in the city here, what they'll do in certain areas is setting a minimum or a certain percentage of new developments that have to be
like rent controlled or low income housing or
totally
Section 8, whatever.
And that helps to mitigate drastically these effects that we're talking about, if nothing else, just to slow them. And in almost case, you have this ideal where you have a mix of old and new residents kind of living together in this new community, whereas one just kind of shoving the other out.
Right. And the problem that a lot of people will talk about with that, and I see this kind of in forums and stuff, people say, well, what's the problem with rent-controlled housing? And they'll say that the problem with it is that it takes, a lot of these apartments off of the market, basically. And then it allows all of these other, non-rent control places to skyrocket. And that actually contributes to gentrification in some places, like you saw that happen in San Francisco. So there's arguments against that too. But what I think is the problem is that it shouldn't just be like, these buildings here are rent controlled. It should be the case for all of the buildings, like across the board, so that, even just kind of middle class people will still be able to keep affording apartments. Because, what we're seeing in cities, even in Chicago, is that rents are going up at such a rate that even middle class people are having a hard time finding a place to live.
That's a good point, just about the city here. And even on our ride home this morning from lunch, I saw yet another luxury condo going up. I feel like if I had $1 for every luxury condo, I could at least afford my next lunch, because in every neighborhood I go to, there's at least one or two cropping up, sometimes even 3 or 4. And we talk about this a lot, but I'm like, who are all these rich people in Chicago, and why aren't I one of them? But
I don't know.
I think you rarely, if ever, see new developments going up that are more affordable, even just for middle class people. Forget everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that kind of goes back to the earlier point, where businesses will always find a way to make new money, and the best way to make the most money: sell a high priced luxury product. Don't make something for the middle class or more, anyone. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the thing about letting the market decide, is that housing is something that people need. It's not like an iPhone or, a teapot or something else that we're like, sure, let the market decide, because it doesn't really matter. Like, you don't need a teapot to survive. You don't necessarily need, an iPhone to survive. But people need housing.
Yeah. And I think what you were talking about earlier in Canada, so what they do is, at least from when I looked into it, there's like a max of 2.5% that landlords can raise rent.
Yeah.
And that's for the entire province, like you were getting at, not just one community. Whereas here, you'll see one neighborhood, and really just one section of a neighborhood where it's rent controlled. Right. So the rest of the neighborhood is kind of just free game. But if we had an entire city, or even an entire state body dedicated to regulating rent, I think you would mitigate a lot of these problems. And the thing I wanted to bring up coming into this discussion is another essential product, like homeowners insurance, renters insurance. All of these products are basically regulated on a state level. If you're an insurance company, you need to submit for the rate that you would like to raise it to. And in many cases, the government has to approve that. And if they don't, you have to then submit something else. And again, this varies from state to state, but I think you see a lot more stability in markets like that. Whereas with rent, it's really anyone's game. It's just who can make the most money the quickest.
Absolutely. And, you know, for even for people like us, like we're pretty middle class people, but we definitely have a situation where if for some reason our property management company decided to add $200 a month to our rent, we wouldn't be able to afford it anymore. And that is 100% a possibility. You know, there's nothing stopping them from doing that.
Yeah, and I think, why am I worried about a company like Amazon coming to Chicago? I think we were in the top 20 for its second headquarters. I, as a resident, should never be fearful of a company coming here, but I am in my own paranoid way because I don't have any faith that the government would protect people from rising rent. And in fact, they're more than willing to give Amazon tax breaks just so they can charge me more. And I pay for Amazon coming here just so all of my prices can go up and where I can live gets more difficult. Not just to pick on Amazon.
Well, and I think this is such an American thing. You know, I think it's really telling that, you know, we're talking about this like across the board rent control, and it's in Canada.
Yeah.
Where they also have, you know, single payer health insurance and stuff like that, like a much greater social safety net. And it's just that in America, this idea of neoliberalism has taken such a strong hold over the way we, like, not just the way we conduct business, but the way we think. America's a very, like, you know, fend for yourself kind of place. And, you know, you mind your own business and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And, you know, you shouldn't rely on the government to help you. But the fact is that in a country this size, the government needs to step in once in a while because, you know, just completely unregulated business is never going to look out for the little guy. Yeah,
and just starting to play that out even more, you have this idea of you need to fend for yourself. What's the number one way you fend for yourself? You get a job. And it's really easy to say everyone to get a job, but if you get displaced from your community and let's say you have to move out to the suburbs and it takes 2 hours to commute every day to your job, you just lost your job too and your home.
Right.
So sometimes you can't even fend for yourself even if you're trying. So I just think we need to do a little bit better. And I know we're so like anti-regulation, but just a smidge, you know, just like a little sprinkling.
Yeah.
I think would help a ton. And I don't think anyone would miss the money. Well, I mean, I'm sure, you know, like a few people would, but God forbid.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, we talk about, when people talk about gentrification and like rising rents, they kind of point to property tax as the reason why landlords need to raise the rents. Maybe that's true. But I still think that there could definitely be a little bit more regulation into, like, are these rent raises justified?
Yeah, because I'm assuming they say that, but, like, to whom? Who are they defending themselves to?
No, yeah, they don't have to defend it to anybody.
Right, like, if they had to submit and say, okay, I'm raising my rent by 5% this year because property tax went up 2.5%, and I have new residents coming into the area that are demanding higher quality services, and my expenses have gone up 2%. This is what I need. I'd be like,
that would make sense.
Cool. I know. You know, I at least know there's some rationality to it, not just what money can I grab this year.
Right. Well, and that's what this blog post was talking about, was that it's mostly just a situation, and this is what the free market is all about. It's like they see an opportunity to make more money, and so they grab it.
I think the last thing I want to bring up, because I feel like we're on the same page that there needs to be more regulation, and specifically statewide regulation, not just local regulation. But one thing I know we consistently see whenever we read about this is the burden always being placed, you know, on the individual. It's these people's fault, whether it's just a bunch of artists or a bunch of yuppies moving into an area where they don't, you know, like, quote unquote belong. And I think that frustrates me a little bit. I mean, that's just my own personal issue, but I think you'll get flack for the city of Chicago being the most segregated. But then when people try to move outside the area, they're a darn gentrifiers.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you really can't win.
Right. Yeah. And and that just goes back to this American ideal of, like, you know, it's all about the individual. When really, you know, with these like kind of macro level issues where there are a lot of different factors interacting, I think that there needs to be some form of, like, government intervention. And another article I was reading about Toronto, They were referring, because in 2017, basically, the loophole of newer buildings not being rent controlled was closed, and obviously, property owners were not happy about it, and they were complaining that, oh, this is going to ruin the rental market, and they were pointing to all this evidence, like, oh, this developer was going to build all these rental units, but instead they're going to build condos. And the point that the article was making was that that's pretty misleading and not really the case, because in this whole 20-year span where newer buildings were not rent controlled, as like we said before, there wasn't really an increase in rental properties. There was only an increase in rent. So what the problem is that it's expensive to build in Toronto, it's expensive to build in any city, and the developers weren't able to make a profit while setting rent at a rate that people could actually afford, like that most people could afford. And so it's like, that's not an issue of a regulation at all. That's the market. People can't afford your product, and it's too expensive for you to build it at a price that they can afford. That's what the market is. And so in that case, it would actually be beneficial for businesses if the government had some kind of intervention there, some kind of subsidies to make more affordable housing, or even housing built by the government that was affordable.
I feel like all these big businesses get together at a monthly meeting and come up with their strategy.
Yeah.
Because like what you were saying right there, where there's too much regulation, it's impeding my ability to invest in my business. Mm-hmm. Isn't that the exact same argument that we heard from Comcast and Verizon?
Oh, yeah.
Like surrounding net neutrality?
Yep.
There's too much regulation, we can't invest in our business. But every time someone looked into that, it was pretty much BS. Mm-hmm. They had greenlit almost all their different improvements to their network, regardless of whether or not there was going to be net neutrality. Mm-hmm. But now there's a key distinction. They can just charge a little bit more. So, great for them. Maybe not so great for us.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, like, businesses will find a way to make money. So if they're getting regulated, they'll figure out a way to make their product cheaper.
And this is the very last thing I wanted to bring up, because I think it'll be a good close for our segment here, is what we're really asking is that the government actually does more. Mm-hmm. And I think the government lacks a lot of incentive to do more, in the sense, if you have gentrification, a lot of what you have is an area becoming cleaner, mm-hmm. less crime, mm-hmm. bigger tax base, more sales tax being charged. It mm-hmm. actually helps the government.
Right.
And really the only power we have over the government is who we elect, who mm-hmm. we vote in, vote out. Mm-hmm. And I think if we're not actually taking action and voting for the right people that are going to do this, nothing's ever going to change, because mm-hmm. they have no incentive.
I agree. I as much as, we're kind of talking about how it's not all on the individual. Obviously, as individuals, we have certain responsibilities. And I think, one of those responsibilities is being mindful of where you live and being mindful of how you spend your money. Absolutely. Investing in local businesses and small businesses, and, not moving into a neighborhood and completely disregarding the culture that already exists there. All of those are really important things. But one person isn't going to, change the tide of gentrification in a neighborhood. 10 people probably aren't going to change the tide of gentrification in a neighborhood. But what you can do is pay attention and do the research, pay attention to who is running in local elections, and find the people who are going to make positive changes for your community.
Amen. I got nothing else to say. Alrighty. So the final segment of our podcast is called Watch List. In this segment, we'll recommend one TV show or movie that's flying beneath the radar but worth checking out. This week, what we're recommending is a Netflix show called American Vandal. So basically, it's this true crime satire in which two filmmakers in their high school try to get to the bottom of this prank. And basically what this prank is one day in school, everyone's at some meeting or like some kind of like teacher institute
teacher,
day,
like professional development day or something.
And so everyone comes out to the parking lot, and there's these dicks spray painted on 27 cars, and the concept is totally ridiculous. And every episode they're asking who did the dicks, because that's essentially what these two filmmakers are trying to get to the bottom of here. And It is definitely a satire, I would say, in the first couple episodes. So if you've seen Serial or any other show...
Making a Murderer.
Yeah, exactly. If you've seen any show like that, it's going to hit all the right beats. I think what gets amazing is around episode 3 or 4 when I become so enthralled and I really need to know. Okay, seriously, who did the dicks?
Yeah.
Because I need to know.
Yeah. It actually really sucks you into this really silly mystery. In the same way that Making a Murderer or Serial or The Jinx does the same thing. And a lot of people, I remember reading online, a lot of people did not realize that it was a work of fiction. They thought that it was a real documentary made by high school students about a real prank.
Yeah, and all the characters, their different motivations are so clear, and how invested or not they are in who did the dicks is also really clear. And so it sucks you in, and it's not like some other mysteries where they kind of dedicate one episode to examining each person. And then you kind of know as the viewer, dude, this is only episode 4. This person obviously didn't do it, but we're wasting time on them. What this show does really well is for the first third, you're kind of thinking it's this one person. And then for the next third, okay, it could be these 3 people. And then you get to the final third and you're like, I literally have no idea.
Yeah.
And so again, I don't want to say any more, but I've heard no one talking about this show and I'm just literally desperate to talk about it with someone. So please watch it, contact me, and we can talk about it.
Yeah, tweet us. We love it. It's a great show, great mystery, so funny. Performances are incredible. And honestly, it has a lot of heart.
Yeah,
and
I would agree.
It really gets into some actually really interesting ideas, like, that pertain to high school, but that also pertain to just life, Really high quality show. American Vandal. It's on Netflix. It's like 8 to 10 episodes.
Yeah, 8 to 10 episodes.
It's worth your time. All right. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening. This is our 2nd episode. If you're enjoying Forward, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app of choice, and you'll always get the latest episode. We're also on SoundCloud. You can, just get on the RSS feed if you want, if that's easier for you.
So thank you so much for listening. And if you ever have any questions or thoughts or any topic suggestions for us to talk about, you can always shoot us an email at forwardpodcast@gmail.com. That's fwdpodcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.